What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 307. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line from the Mile High City, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. LSV, how goes, sir? How was your day?
I had a good day today. Just a normal day in the life of LSV. So,
little foreshadowing there, buddy.
maybe. And I would say pretty much recovered from the Pro Tour at this point.
Oh God, I'm barely, man. I was in Wisconsin for the GP and I stayed there for the Pro Tour. So I was there for, 10 or 11 days or something. And then I came back home for 2 days. This is one of them. And tomorrow I'm leaving for Quebec City. Then I come back home for 2 days and I'm going to Indianapolis. So I'm getting a little road weary here. I'm having a hard time recovering.
I've been there. I'm mostly not there anymore. I'm not going anywhere for a couple of weeks. I'm skipping a couple of GPs and all that. But, the traveling is something. I mean, myself, Josh and Matt Nass all flew back Monday morning and went straight to work. We landed and we went to work.
That's rough. Yeah.
And then Matt Nass took the next 2 days off because he felt terrible.
Yeah, just shockingly. All right. Before we get into today's festivities, I want to remind you that Limited Resources is brought to you by channelfireball.com. Now, Channel Fireball has a lot to offer on their website. One of my favorite things is free content. That's right. Completely free. You show up on channelfireball.com and you can watch videos of some of the best players in the world. We're talking about some premium talent there, showing you how to play the decks that you want to learn how to play, how to draft the decks that you want to draft. You can read articles that have full sideboard videos if you're into, sideboard sections if you're into constructed, break down the limited formats and the things that we talk about on the show, but in written form if you're, not able to listen at the time. And of course, you can find some podcasts on there as well. In addition to that, they have a full selection of singles, sealed product, and anything else that you might need to get your magic on. I want to remind you that GP CTAC is coming up very quickly, and that should be really fun, Luis. There's even going to be coverage there.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it.
I'm going to be battling. I've got my 75 already figured out. That's not true at all, by the way. But I'm looking forward to the coverage too. I think that there's going to be some fine fellows in the booth, or at least that's what I hear. Yeah,
that's the rumor around town. So that should be fun. Make sure you check that out. And if you'd like to join us, gpctac.com is where you can find all of the information. Of course, the show is also brought to you by you, the listener, via Patreon. It's a great website that allows you to give back to the creators that make things that matter to you. And we are proud to be part of Patreon. And in fact, today, Luis, is the day that we are giving away a playmat. Now, the playmat that I'm going to give away here is actually the playmat that you get if you go to GPC TAC, and it is sick. It's a two-sided, a double-sided playmat, so you can flip it over and it's got another playmat on the other side, and it is Delver of Secrets, the original artwork for Delver of Secrets, and I've actually got it sitting here. It was a gift to me, but I've decided that I wanted a listener to have it. I just thought it would be cool. Now, I can't send it until after the GP weekend is over. That way it goes out at the same time as people in the GP. I don't want to send it out prematurely, but I will be shipping it off, and I have our winner here. This was taken from anybody who's a patron. So if you donate on the Patreon, then you are eligible here, and the winner is Rocky Saber.
And I assume that's
a name, or
that's a real name.
Yeah, that's it. So Rocky, thank you so much for your continued support. I really appreciate it. I've got your address here. If it's changed, maybe send me an email, lr@lrcast.com, to make sure that it's the correct one. And I'm going to be sending out your playmat after GP CTAC, which is in the early part of November. Now, we've got other giveaways coming up as well through the Patreon, including all the rares that we've opened in the Cracker Packs. I've got, 3 weeks or a month worth sitting here that are going to go out to somebody. And I usually do a little LR gift pack with some stickers, some sleeves, a button, that kind of stuff in it as well. So we'll probably do that probably next week. Another thing that you get if you are on the Patreon is you get to ask questions. I have a special section for listeners to ask questions that we will read on the show. We pick one every single week. There's too many to read all of them, but that's where you can get a direct line to us. And this Patreon question of the week comes from Adam Gotway, who asks, he says, I'd like to hear what a day in the life is like for each of our hosts. And not necessarily a big day like day one of a pro tour, more like an average Wednesday. how much Magic are you guys playing? Do you work the game into your day, or do you work your day around the game? And he had to throw in, and I need to use the term day loosely for Marshall. He says, thanks, Adam, father of the littlest Marsh Hulk. So that's our question. And I thought that would be kind of a fun change of pace. Usually we get more strategy or kind of etiquette questions or things like that here, but
how to time people out on Magic Online.
Yeah. And this one's a little different. This one's a little more personal about you and I, Luis, which, I'm fine with that or whatever. So do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll go first.
What's your day like? What's a Wednesday like for Luis?
So a typical Wednesday for me is getting up. I set my alarm for about 8. I have to be at work at 9, but I usually get up, I would say around 8:20 or so. And I leave the house within about 15 minutes. I get ready quickly.
That sounds scary.
Yeah, well, I would rather sleep than spend a long time getting ready. That's the trade-off that I've made. And I would say my average day involves a breakfast burrito and a cup of coffee. That would be breakfast.
Hold on, I'm taking notes.
And then I go to work. I mean, it helps that I have a stand-up right at 9 o'clock. A stand-up's like a short meeting where everyone, stands up and, kind of reports on what they did yesterday, what they're planning on doing today, making sure everyone's synced up. And I that's actually useful because it means I have to be there right at 9 at the very latest, or I'm missing a meeting. So it helps me stay on time for sure. And then I've got work. I mean, I'm a game designer right now. That's what I do during the daytime. Well, it's one of the things I do at least. And getting to work on games and play games, and that's a lot of fun. And I work until 6, so it's that is the bulk of my day is work, which makes a lot of sense. That's what a 9 to 6 is. And after work, I've got a variety of things I'll do on see, if you said an average Thursday, actually would involve me playing basketball. Me and a bunch of the guys from work and a couple of our friends here play basketball after work on Thursdays. So though we need to find a new place. There actually is a winter here in Denver, and it's getting to the point
very real.
where we can't play outside. Yeah, it is. The icy grip of reality is here. I'll also, frequently come home. I cook dinner most days. I'm certainly the cook here at home, and so, I cooked tonight, cooked yesterday, and all that. So I'll cook dinner and hang out with my wife some. And then usually I'll have some sort of Magic related thing to do after work. Tonight it happened to be that I was on Magic TV for Channel Fireball for about an hour. And then now I'm here and we're recording the podcast. So I'm probably not going to get to play Magic today. I didn't get to play any games earlier, so because I'm going to go to bed probably pretty soon after this. But a lot of days involve me playing some kind of Magic, whether it's recording, rarely streaming. I usually stream on the weekends just because that's when I have more time. But I'll record or I'll just play. Like we mentioned GPC TAC before, and I was joking about having my 75, but I actually know that I'm going to play Miracles unless something drastic changes. And because I'm, going to play in a GP in a couple weeks, I'm going to try to play a couple days a week with the deck I want to play, so I know how to play it. And that's most of my days is some combination of playing games, whether it's at work or at home, and making content of some kind, again, whether it's at work or at home. A lot of this blends together. I've got articles to write and whatnot. And then on the weekends, it's maybe a little less gaming than you'd think, because I actually do tons of gaming during the week.
The one thing I think that doesn't stand out to your description of your day is how busy you are. You're insane. I mean, it's funny because I think that you've been at it for such a long time that people kind of just take it for granted. But like you put out an absurd amount of content, especially for somebody who maintains a full-time job as well. And that's the thing that kind of stands out to me is that, by the time I get you, you're usually coming off of having written something or, recorded something else. And this is all after your normal work day and after getting some time in, with the family and all that stuff. And so, yeah, that's the one thing that kind of stands out to me is just how slammed you are, pretty much perpetually. Cause then oftentimes you're traveling for a tournament on the weekend and then coming back and repeating it all. And the margins of time are pretty short. I actually don't know how you hold up.
Weekends help me recharge. This is why I'm going to fewer tournaments now. It's part of the reason, at least. The other part is, if I won more, I'd probably want to go to more tournaments. But sure. Weekends do help me recharge. I mean, I'll get to catch up on work that I didn't get to do during the week, and also catch up on relaxation time. So, I certainly value my free time pretty highly. Good,
yeah. My average day is kind of different than Luis's. it comes in two. There's two different types of average day that I have. He said, I'm not talking about day one at the Pro Tour. That's fine. But the thing is, I go to every North American GP to do coverage, every single one. And, like the scenario I'm describing here, well, almost every single one, is, I'm doing 5 tournaments in a row and then a week off and then a tournament. And all of them are away from home except for one, which is an hour away from home. And so when I go to a GP, I fly on Thursday. And we're recording this on a Wednesday, for example, and I got home Monday from Milwaukee. So I had Tuesday and today to just be home. And I got to get up early tomorrow and go to the airport on Thursday, where I'll arrive in Quebec City. And then on a Friday, I set up the GP. And then Saturday, Sunday, I broadcast it. And then Monday, I'm coming home again. So if one of those days happens to be a travel day, then I'm packing and getting out the door and arranging a ride or a parking spot and just doing all the normal crappy travel stuff that comes with it. But on the days when I'm actually home, it looks a bit different. I usually stay up till about 3 or 4 in the morning because I'm just like a super night owl. I hate going to bed. Every time I have to go to bed, I'm like, oh, come on. And the thing I really hate is waking up in the morning. I suck at that. I'm just not functional in the morning for the most part. So I just sleep through it. And I'll get up at, 10-ish or something like that after having gone to bed at, 3 or 4 in the morning. So I actually don't sleep that much. I think there's a common misconception among night owls like me that they sleep too much. But the reality is I try to get 7 hours, but I usually end up getting more in the 6 to 7 range, as opposed to the 8 that I probably should get.
Well, the older you are, the less sleep you need.
Is that true? Because I'm hoping it goes down.
That's what I've heard.
I feel
Can't
like
verify getting older.
Yeah, I might be the exception to that rule. I am getting older, but I'm for some reason I still feel tired sometimes. But anyway, when I'm home, I'll wake up and I usually eat some breakfast and then I'll go down to the gym to shoot baskets or do some weights or just kind of do the gym thing, and then I'll come back. And then I'll work. And work depends on the day. I got to write the column every week. I got to record a couple of videos for Channel Fireball. I got to do this podcast and constructed resources most weeks, but when I'm traveling a lot, it tends to go down a bit, how often I can do CR. And then I'll have random other stuff. Like I subbed with Randy on the Super Leagues for a couple of weeks. And, these other things will just pop up here and there along those lines. And I also like to cook, so I'll often on the way back from the gym pick up stuff at the store so that I can cook for me and my girlfriend, and I'll make some good dinner, and we'll watch a show or whatever. And then after she goes to bed, because she's got to get up early for work, I'll work again. I'll do anything that I didn't get finished. I'll manage the stuff for the Patreon or any of the podcast stuff and all that. And I'll often stream as well. And I'll fire up the stream around 11 or midnight and stream till 2 or 3 in the morning, just because that's kind of when I have time to do it and when it's quiet here. And then I go to sleep and rinse and repeat. And that is what most of my days look like. And I don't feel relaxed. I will say that. I feel like I do too much stuff and I need to make sure I'm not, I have to manage that, right? It's not like...
Yeah, I feel the same way.
You feel the same, right? Yeah, because you do, and I probably do too. All right, so we'll cut that off there. Oh, go ahead.
Like I told you a couple weeks ago, I can think of a way to save maybe 2 to 3 hours a week pretty easily.
No, I did not like that idea then, and I don't like it now. Look, this is the time that I look forward to. This is the payoff for me. I get to hang out with Luis. I get to talk to a bunch of our closest friends over the podcast, and this is the fun part for me.
No, I actually completely agree. Yeah. I have loved being on the podcast. I hope people are enjoying it. It is both more work than I thought it was going to be and more fun than I thought it was going to be. In all good ways.
I get you.
I like preparing. I like writing show notes and trying to make sure it feels satisfying to have a good topic, to cap off the show notes and just to get into the show. And then obviously talking and hanging out with Marshall is something I put up with.
That's premium real estate right there.
It's buddy. Great. I mean, if you looked at if you looked at Worlds and PAX, I think we hung out basically the whole time, even when we weren't working. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right, let's crack a pack, Luis. As we get into our main topic.
I do have some logistical questions about crack packs. I got a couple of crack packs at the Pro Tour, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how am I supposed to get the contents of those packs to the winning listener?
Wait, did you open some?
Oh, I didn't open any. I just have a couple.
Oh, you got a couple.
Yeah.
Oh, then what you'll have to do is probably bring them to the next GP or event that we go to, and I'll put them in the pile together.
Sounds good. And if there's any expeditions, as usual, we split them.
No, they will go to a viewer or a listener if we are lucky enough to get one, which I actually really hope we do. Giant Mantis is our first card.
Giant Mantis. I'm not a giant fan of it.
No, I'm not either. I mean, I think, that one of the big things coming off of the Pro Tour was how down on green everybody was. I also agree that it's the worst color. I think I played a little more often than maybe some of the pros, but Giant Mantis is just not really anywhere near what I want to be looking at for a first pick.
Yeah, it doesn't lead me in any particular direction. It's not super powerful, so I wouldn't look at taking this early.
Yeah, Anticipate is next. We've talked quite a bit about Anticipate. Better than I thought it was going to be. I predicted in the set review that it would fill its role that it usually has for cards like this, which is that I take it thinking that I'm going to play it, and then it ends up being like my 23rd, 24th card, and it doesn't make the cut. But it actually has more, just again because there's just not that many 2-drops, and I want something to do for 2 mana. Also, the format isn't blazingly fast, so you do have a little bit more time to actually play cards like this. All of that said, definitely not first pick at it.
No, Anticipate is, like you said, better than we thought, even though I already liked the card. And
yeah, you liked it, yeah.
But still not a first pick by any stretch.
Mindraker is next. That's the 3 and a black 3/3 with process. They discard a card.
This is one of the weaker processors.
Yeah, I just never have been super impressed by it. I think it's playable. I have certainly played it in multiple decks, but I've never been blown away by Mindraker.
No, basically, if you aren't in the processor deck, it's quite bad. And if you are, you usually have better things like Mercstrider, the 3/2 that bounces a creature. That's what you want to be processing.
Yeah, that's business.
Mindraker is kind of using space you don't really need used.
Cliffside Lookout is the white 1/1. It's a Core Scout ally, and you can pay 5 mana to give your team +1/+1 until end of turn.
Yeah, this card is better than it looks.
Yeah, it's fine.
Just because the ally decks tend to want this effect. So even though it's a 1 mana 1/1, the ability is actually good enough. And the fact that it triggers allies is also good, but we're still nowhere near the ballpark of a first pick.
Exactly. Outnumber. I really want to know where you're at on Outnumber, Luis. That's the red instant deals damage to target creature equal to the number of creatures you control.
I've cooled a little bit on it. I still think the card is good, and I think you'll want it in a lot of your red decks. But I think that it's just decent. It's not great.
Yeah, I'm on that too. Really trappy card. Like, it's easy to look at it because when it's good, it's so good, right? Like when they play a creature just to get enough creatures on board and then have 1 extra mana to outnumber your thing, and they just played 2 things in 1 turn. They developed their board and for 1 mana took out like your best blocker or whatever you had going on the other side. It looks so amazing when that happens, but it is easy to overlook the times when you have a good amount of removal and the outnumber never gets to the stage of being able to kill the thing that they really need to kill or that they really want to kill, and it sits in their hand or just has a marginal effect like killing a smaller creature, which I think is its average case, is to kill a small to medium creature rather than anything much bigger, although occasionally that does happen. I've been fine with it, though. I'm not super high on it either. Bone Splinters is back.
Yeah, it's a fine card. The problem I have with Bone Splinters is that the deck that it's supposed to be good in, the like black-green sacrifice deck, is not a deck I really like drafting all that much. So I find Bone Splinters to not have a ton of places to go. Yeah,
I've definitely found myself putting Bone Splinters in what I think now is too many decks. Like I just think, okay, I need this. I need a way to kill something big. But if I really took the time to look at my creatures, I would notice that like not many of them are expendable. I'm not really making Eldrazi Scions. I just don't have, I'm really just 2 for 1 myself to kill a creature. And, while that is acceptable in certain cases, it certainly shouldn't be plan A. And so I've cooled off on Bone Splinters unless I really know that it goes in the deck I want it to. Broodhunter Worm. This guy looks so reasonable. The 4 mana 4/3.
Yeah, we sung the praises of the Summit Prowler both times it showed up in the last couple sets. The 2 red 4/3, and this is better than that. It's 3 and a green for a 4/3. The fact is, the poor Brood Hunter worm is in the wrong world.
He's lost in the woods. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Grown up in the wrong era, and we'll talk more about that later. But suffice to say, this is not a card you should first pick.
Right. Mortuary Mire. That's the black tap land, and it allows you to put a creature from your graveyard on top of your library, if you'd like.
And I have not been as impressed with the non-basics. I like the Sandstone Bridge and the Smoldering Spires, the white and the red ones.
The Lumine Spires, yeah.
Lumine Spires. But I'm not as happy with the Mortuary Mire as those. Basically, Mortuary Mire is a card you want to play early because it comes to play tapped. And I always have that problem, except for Fertile Thicket, where you want to play them early because they come to play tapped, but you need to play them late to get the effect. And Mortuary Mire is one I've just so infrequently actually wanted to put something back on top that I'm starting to get to the point where I think you just don't play the card.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a good way to sort of put a litmus test on this is, how often do I turn one, just play Mortuary Mire just to make sure that it's on the battlefield? And the fact is, I do it basically every time it's in my opening hand. I'm just like, sure, whatever, because the effect is pretty minor ultimately. I'm definitely down on the card as well. Here's a card I like quite a bit now. Tightening Coils. That's the 1 in a blue enchantment aura. Creature gets -6/-0 and loses flying.
Yeah, Tightening Coils is a great card. It just fits really well into basically with all the blue decks, because the blue decks tend to have evasive, whether it's unblockable like Benthic Infiltrator or just a bunch of flyers. So Tightening Coils is kind of like Terminate.
It's...
That's not a fair comparison.
Kind of like Terminate.
Terminate costs 2 different colors to cast.
Right.
Harder to cast. Tightening Coils is 1 in a blue, so it's actually just easier to cast.
Much better than Terminate, right?
Yep.
Lumine
I called Sensory Deprivation the one from Innistrad that's blue -3/- Swords to Plowshares.
The blue Swords to Plowshares.
And Tightening Coils is 2 mana, so I guess it's just Terminate.
It is not Terminate. Lumine Spires is next. That is the red version that you mentioned. You said you like this one.
I do like Looming Spires. I don't like taking it early, but it lets you push through an attack pretty nicely. So I think the red aggressive decks do want this card.
Yeah, I think it's fine too. Oh, here's a card. Now, of all the cards that we've seen here, there's really none that jump out to me as a first pick. But this one, this uncommon, does. It's Stasis Snare.
Well, this is just one of the better uncommons in the set.
Yeah.
1 white, exile any creature, instant speed enchantment. So it's just a great card. It doesn't commit you to anything but playing white. It's a heavy white card, double white, but still, it's just a fantastic card. So I would be happy first picking a Stasis Snare. That's I would say above average for a first pick.
Agreed. Yeah, that card's epic in this set too, where a lot of the removal's a lot slower. Here's an important question for the set. This is Blighted Fen. So this is the black. Tap land, it makes colorless mana. You can pay 4 and a black, tap it, and sack it to have an opponent sacrifice a creature.
Blighted Fen is decent. I've seen games where it's fantastic, but I've also seen a lot of games where it just doesn't do a whole lot, just because by the time you can sacrifice it, often they'll have random creatures on the board. There are some decks that are really weak against it, like decks that don't have small creatures, and Blighted Fen's fantastic there. In general, I would say it's not a really high pick, just because colorless lands are kind of brutal, especially in a format with not a ton of fixing.
So a question then. Let's say that Blighted Fen is in your pool of cards. You're playing a black deck. You have no other non-basic lands. Do you always play Blighted Fen? The first
depends on my mana situation. Like if I'm playing let's say I'm playing white-black life gain, and I have like Serene Steward and Stonehaven Medic, the white tap gain a life, and whenever you gain a life, pay a white. So I'm just I want like 10 planes in my deck. Mm-hmm. Then I'm a lot less likely to play Blighted Fen because I just don't have the room. My color requirements are so strong. Okay. But if I'm black-red devoid aggro, where every card in my deck is one single colored mana cost, then yeah, I'll play like 9/8 plus a Devoid Fen or 8/8 plus a Devoid Fen and not feel too bad about it.
Okay. Ulamog's Despoiler. Card has not impressed me. It's 6 colorless mana for a 5/5, and if you process 2 cards from your opponent, it comes in with 4+1/+1 counter, so it ends up being a big dumb 9/9.
Ulamog's Despoiler is a fine card. It's, like you said, nothing exciting, and nothing really worth building around, even though you just play it in those decks some of the time.
Yeah, to me, it's like on my backup list. It's like in a pinch if I need a payoff. The fact that it's 6 mana is pretty reasonable. But yeah, I'm not a big fan. Ooh, I love this rare. It's Fathom Feeder.
Fathom Feeder is very good.
Yeah, it's the blue-black 1/1 Death Touch with Devoid and Ingest, and you can pay 5 mana to draw a card and also ingest your opponent for 1. Been really impressed by this thing.
Yeah, Fathom Feeder is quite good. I would say...
Like, I'm still on Stasis Snare.
Yeah, I would say I would take Stasis Snare here just because like, as good as Fathom Feeder is, it is still not worth playing, or committing to 2 different colors immediately. If both these cards cost colorless, I could see it. But even then, Stasis Snare might be better. So I don't think it's actually that close.
I don't either. Yeah. I and the thing is that I think Fathom Feeder is very strong, and I just really like it, which is a really strong pull. But a card like Stasis Snare is so good in a format like this where people do tend to make... maybe they don't make as many Eldrazi as we thought coming in, and, it's not quite that type of format, but they still do have, big bombs and things that you need to deal with. Sometimes people will pile up multiple Awaken counter activation or whatever's on one land, and just having an instant speed, cheap way to take out a creature in combat or to remove a bomb that generally stays on the battlefield is so strong. And in all the ways that Fathom Feeder is cool and kind of cute and transitions from early game to late game and kind of makes your opponent groan if they don't want to trade for it or whatever, Stasis Snare is just like no nonsense, ask nothing of you, just beat face. It just does its job and does it better than basically anything else. So I would take a Stasis Snare here.
I agree.
I am a fan. All right, so you go over there, Fathom Feeder, where you will be shipped off to a stranger at some point. I mean, a friend. All right, so let's get into our main topic here, Luis. It's going to be kind of an interesting one, I think, for us, because we've got some discussion to do here, and this is an important topic that we have certainly received a lot of feedback on in the wake of the set being released, and also the Pro Tour and the GP, and kind of as things have settled down with this new format. And we've got a lot of feedback. I've heard it from people in real life and also via the internet that you guys are having a hard time with the format. It's complicated. It's a lot different than Origins or Dragons, which were the 2 preceding formats. And you're feeling a little bit lost on it, and we hear you. I certainly know where you're coming from with that. And so Luis and I thought, well, let's go a little deeper here for this episode, and let's take a look and get into the kind of nitty gritty of how a format like Battle for Zendikar works. What are the moving parts? And I don't mean we're going to break down the archetypes for you. We're probably going to do that on a different show after we really get settled in. But
given that we keep saying that, if we just never do it,
that'd be kind of great. That would be very Scott-Vargas.
That's the sort of thing that warms my bitter trolling heart.
Yes,
not that I'm an actual troll. I just play one on MTV.
That's yeah. All right, no comment.
All right, let's move on.
I've got a lot of text message evidence to the contrary, but anyway, we hear you. This format is weird and it's hard to grasp and it isn't obvious and there's a lot of little loopholes and little things that you need to know. And so Luis and I thought, let's talk about it on the show. Let's talk to the listeners and kind of get an idea for how these type of things work. So where should we start here, Luis?
So I think that, we had a brief discussion of this before the show. Why is this harder than, say, Modern Masters? Because we've made the comparison to Modern Masters a bunch of times, given that there's these, 10 2-color pairs and that there's, maybe not that many different decks, but a lot of different, like somewhat linear decks that want specific cards in a specific strategy and don't care about much past that. Mm-hmm. The biggest reason I think that we're getting the feedback this is harder than Modern Masters is it's way more drafted. It's just orders of magnitude more people are doing, or more drafts of this format are being done because it's just so much easier to get a hold of the packs and because this is just the normal set and everyone's drafting it. Everyone who's interested in Limited is just going to draft it. So I think more people may have had trouble with Modern Masters if this many people drafted it. So I'm not convinced that it's just Battle's more difficult. I think it's just Battle is for wider consumption. So. Yeah,
and also the core audience for Modern Masters is the hardcore and franchise drafter anyway. And this is and Battle for Zendikar is for everybody. So it does make sense. And
Battle for Zendikar is basically all new cards. There's a couple reprints here and there, but it's like any expert level expansion. It's 90% new cards or whatever that number is.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Modern Masters was 100% reprints. So even if you had never drafted it before, once you did draft it, you'd seen all the cards. You at least had some idea of what they do. Whereas this is just a bunch of new mechanics, a new format, new cards. And it's really hard to get a handle on exactly what these cards do and what this format does. And, we talked about all these cards in our set review, but we had to say stuff like Mist Intruder. This card might be very good, or it might not, have a good place because it's, on its face doesn't look great.
Right.
As it turns out, with that card specifically, it is very good. It's a card you really want if you're in the deck that wants it, and you absolutely don't want if you're in the deck that's not. And that's hard to figure out sometimes. Not whether you're in the deck or not, because that becomes clear a couple picks in, but more like, should you be in the deck, and how do you make sure you get into the deck, or how do you avoid being in the deck when it's not open? All these questions are very hard to answer.
Yeah, and going back a little bit, right? Most limited formats are complex. Like limited is not a simple thing, right? Like it has a barrier to entry even for people that are already Magic players. And for those of you that can remember the first time you learned to play Magic, you'll remember feeling quite overwhelmed at first about all the rules and all the stuff and what a deep game it is. Now, these are some of the reasons why the game's so great, right? Because otherwise we'd get bored of it if it was too simple. But at the same time, there's already barriers to entry upon barriers to entry here. And by the time you finally sit down to do a draft, you have to know a whole lot of things. Now, the payoff's there. Drafting is super fun. It's one of my favorite activities, just full stop. And the payoff's there. But if you look at it, most limited formats are actually quite difficult to grasp and to figure out. But we have guidelines, right? We have things that guide us through the formats. And mainly, those are colors. Those are just the colors of the cards. Those are sort of our guideposts for how we draft a format. So if a format happens to be, let's say, a two-color style format where there's a little bit of fixing, but basically your decks are going to be two colors. Well, the idea then becomes to draft the best pile of cards that you can within those two colors. Now, that would be something like an Origins or, in some ways, a Dragons of Tarkir type set. And we all know that it goes deeper than that, right? That's a oversimplified way to represent what a draft, how to draft and how to play limited. But, these signposts are there, right? Like when you get to pack 2 and you know what 2 colors you are, you can basically ignore all the other cards in the pack, narrow it down to just the 2, 3, or 4 cards that happen to be in your 2 colors and take the best one. And then repeat that over and over again. And it's likely that you'll come up with a pretty decent deck if you're dealing with one of these types of sets. Now, there's always going to be these exceptions and these things that aren't obvious. And that's part of the fun of playing limited is to figure those things out. Sometimes they go another level deeper, right? And you get a set like Khans of Tarkir, which was a 3-color set and also had these morphs in it. And so these are wrinkles that they throw at us and we have to adjust to them. We have to figure out, well, if it's 3 colors, can I just be 3 colors? Can I splash into a 4th? Is there a 5-color deck? Am I rewarded for just being 2 colors? And there's all these interesting questions and cool things that we had to sort out when we first got Khans. So there's twists on it, but ultimately it comes down to, again, the colors are the signposts for these type of decks. When you get to a set like the one that we're in now, Battle for Zendikar, the colors still act as signposts. Like they still guide you. I mean, you're still going to be mostly in just a 2-color deck.
Well, what about the cards that are colorless? Because they say colorless on them.
Yeah, so I'm counting those as colored cards for the purposes of discussion. But the thing is that that's where it really breaks down, because I can easily say, okay, you're in a deck. Right. And I'll, pick a random archetype that's in Battle for Zendikar. And I can show you 2 cards that are within the colors that you would be in. And I can even show you one that on its surface is more powerful. And I could then tell you that you absolutely should not take the more powerful on the surface, in a vacuum card. You should totally take the Mist Intruder or the card that doesn't look very good, because that's what you need to make these decks work. And now you repeat that out over the, 10 or, maybe there's not quite that many viable color pairs, but, however many there are, there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it is. And all of a sudden you've got kind of a mess on your hands, right? You're looking at it like, well, I have to know every single one of these and when to make the exception and take not just the very good card and instead take the archetype card or the, the synergy card, if you will, for each one, and when not to, because there's also exceptions going the other direction, right? Like if I show you, as an example, a very good red-blue devoid deck, right? This is a deck that cares about colorless cards being in your deck and rewards you for having as many as possible. Well, you might think that if I show you, say, a Vestige of Emrakul, perfectly fine colorless card, and then I showed you a Rolling Thunder, that after what I had just said, well, you should take the Vestige of Emrakul because that's the one that goes in the deck. But of course, Rolling Thunder actually eclipses the power level to such a degree that it becomes sort of the reverse exception to the rule. And now all of a sudden you are actually just picking the Rolling Thunder over it because the card is that much more powerful. But if I were to, switch the argument up and give you maybe a card that's a little bit better than Vestige of Emrakul, but not a lot, I could convince you to take, the Vestige of Emrakul because it's colorless and it'll fit better in your deck. And this is a lot to navigate, right? I mean, this is why people are feeling like this, right? They're feeling like, well, I have to know all of these things to get this right. And if I don't, what does my deck look like? It's not very good. And so, I guess what I really want to say here, to sort of encapsulate this whole point is that, yes, it is complicated. And yes, you should feel a little bit confused as you sort of sort things through. But the cool part is that's actually the fun part. That's the part that, we get a little more to work with here, and things aren't going to be obvious. And it is going to take us a little while to kind of dig into this.
Yeah. If this, this format may feel kind of confusing and difficult to those who have just drafted a bunch of Origins, for example. And some part of that isn't fun. I mean, it's not fun to lose. I can certainly attest to that. And and this is jumping into the deep end. I can imagine, a decent portion of our listeners who maybe have drafted for even a couple of years, even if like over a year, if not more, even 2 years or something. And going from, like you said, Cons, Fate Reforged, Dragons, Origins to this, it's all of a sudden holy crap, what is going on?
Yeah.
And trying to, my first couple drafts of this format are very different than my drafts now because just the relative values of everything is really tricky. Knowing when to commit and when not is really tricky. This is a very difficult set to draft, but don't confuse that with a bad set to draft because, we've had sets that I can just call bad. I think Avacyn Restored was not a fun set to draft.
Right.
I did the bare minimum of drafts and stopped. I'm glad I wasn't on the show back then because I would have a hard time wanting to talk about it every week.
We may have had a lot of guest appearances on there.
Right. And that's because that experience wasn't very fun. It was nothing to do with how difficult it was. It just wasn't fun. Whereas, I've had fun drafting these last couple sets and I'm having fun drafting Battle for Zendikar. I expect this to be a reasonably deep format that's it has legs. I enjoy it. It is difficult, but difficulty is part of the fun. If all the sets weren't difficult, I would have less fun. And figuring out, how to navigate through this format, it's tough, but I do think it's worth it. Once you've learned how to do this, you're in a lot better shape for future formats, just because, this is expanding your repertoire when it comes to drafting and just figuring out these puzzles. I mean, Magic is a game about puzzles, and that's not for everyone. People get whatever meanings they want. There's a lot of different ways to play Magic. Part of what I like about Magic is figuring out the puzzle aspect of it. And Battle for Zendikar's got plenty of puzzles to figure out.
Yeah. Now, a few minutes ago, you had mentioned Modern Masters, the latest one or the one before, either way. And we kind of compared the two sets. Now, when you compare Modern Masters to Battle for Zendikar, do you see a lot of similarities? What are the differences? How should I be seeing this comparison?
I think that it is like Modern Masters. And I think that the reason we keep going back to that is that that's the closest comparison in the last couple sets.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also similar to Rise of the Eldrazi for those who drafted during that set. So that's another set where actually Original Mirrodin has a lot of similarities here too.
Oh, is that right? It was pretty narrow as far as what decks you were rewarded for and that kind of stuff.
I mean, like Battle, Original Mirrodin has some normal draft decks where you just take cards that are good and play them, because Battle has some of that going on. But also like Battle, if you drafted the Affinity deck in Original Mirrodin, you would be taking Mirror Enforcer and Frogmite super early. You'd be taking Artifact Land second pick. Actually, funnily enough, Ben Stark, who actually top 8 2 Pro Tours that year, I think he went on record saying he would take Seed of the Synod over, the equivalent of Rolling Thunder in that set. Seed of the Synod being the blue artifact land, just taps for blue mana and counts as an artifact as a land. That's it. And that's indicative of a format where something's going on, where, something synergy based is happening, and Battle has a lot of synergy, and figuring out how to harness that and when not to harness that is I think the main trick, because where a lot of people are going wrong, I suspect, and again, I've had this happen to myself. You mentioned earlier that, like, if you draft a bunch of blue and red cards, sometimes you just don't have a deck, and that's just true. You sometimes you can take cards that look reasonable, especially if you compare them to cards in previous sets, but they don't combine in any way that's good. And you end up with just a pile of cards and nothing close to a deck.
Yeah, so, and that is weird. I think that's kind of catching some people off guard.
Basically it couldn't happen in Origins or Dragons or Fate Reforged. If you drafted a bunch of good cards, you had a decent deck at the very least, and there's not much deeper going on. And yeah, sure, the blue-black exploit deck, which I love, by the way, was better than just its cards because it combined in really cool ways. But end of the day, you can still just draft, flyers and removal spells and or even just ground creatures like a Curve of 2-drops and be okay. Whereas in Battle, if you draft, a bunch of like belligerent whiptails and random 2-drops, all of a sudden you're just going to end up with your cards doing less than your opponent's cards.
Yeah, and that is the thing, right? Is that we are talking about multiple layers of being good at limited here, and we've added a couple with Battle for Zendikar. Now, the main point here, of course, is don't panic. It's okay. We're going to get you through it, and we're going to be talking about it on the show, frequently here to help you start to get in on each of the little niches and the little archetypes. I wrote about it for the column this week, about the 3 different main devoid decks, and you're going to kind of do some research and do that. And that's part of the deal, right? This is not the kind of thing that we can give you just one piece of advice and then it'll fix. This is going to have to be you talking and drafting and reading and getting into it. And, that's, again, I view that as an opportunity, not as like a chore. If I could just, walk into a new draft format, already understand it, already be good at it, I probably wouldn't do it for very long. Like this process of discovery and trial and error and stuff is a lot of what I really enjoy about Limited. And I'm sure as a listener of the show, you probably do too. So I think the key here, embrace it, right? This is going to be fun, but we're not going to leave you empty handed, when it comes to figuring this stuff out either, because, one of the things that we like to do on the show is try to come up with tools or methods to help you simplify things and to get to the meat of the information and the data and really try to figure out what's going on in a format and also not fall for, pitfalls that your brain will lead you down. And so for this one thing that we thought we would do is to group cards and to kind of show you how Luis and I may group some of the cards in the set into kind of buckets, so that they can be, so that you have a bigger picture viewpoint, and maybe you could write it out yourself or whatever to try to get an idea of which cards belong where and how good they are in those things and which cards don't belong anywhere and that whole thing. So what was your main idea behind doing these buckets, Luis?
Well, first of all, I've learned my lesson. This is absolutely not a theory. This is not bucket theory.
I actually put it on the notes as bucket theorem.
Oh, it's a bucket theorem?
Yeah.
So,
as a joke.
Under no means should anyone be referring to this as anything, as that elaborate. What this is trying to explain, and I purposely limited myself to not every single example in the set, is know which cards belong where and which cards can, and we call them buckets because that's an easy way of like separating them. Like, and so each bucket is like a different deck, like, Life Gain or Ingest or what have you. Know which cards belong in which bucket and know which cards belong in multiple buckets, and try to, have a sense of what you're doing as you navigate through a draft. Try to figure out, like, why are you taking a specific card and what path is it leading you down, or in which bucket are you going to end up if you take cards, cards that belong there. And then one of the key parts, I think, is figuring out cards that are good on their face, but don't belong in a good way to any bucket, and therefore will end up, I think, being worse for you. Like, if you put these cards in your deck, I think you're hurting your chances.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to me, right? Because what you said is they're good cards. They're cards that you would normally play in a set, yet somehow they've become traps here in Battle for Zendikar, because if you do put them in, they're probably not contributing to the bigger picture approach of your deck. and all of a sudden they're a liability, which is really weird, right? Because a lot of draft formats don't have this catch to them, and you play the good cards because they're good, and if they're on color and you can cast them, you do, and then you win more games. Yet here, they could actually be hurting you, which is really crazy, considering that normally we would give these cards like a pretty good grade.
Yeah, and not to preview it too much, but Broodhunter Worm,
poor Broodhunter Worm,
is one of the textbook examples of that. I actually remember, talking at the Pro Tour with one of the other teams. Once the drafting has started, people tend to talk a little bit more about what their plans were before the draft, and talking with the other teams is a good way to advance your strategy. And I try to help figure out what other people are thinking, so I can presumably get better at limited. And one of the first things that got brought up was like, if you put cards like Broodhunter Worm in your deck, then you're not really drafting the format. You're putting cards that have no real place in the format in your deck, and you're I think going to lose more because of it. I'm not saying Broodhunter Worm is absolutely unplayable. I'm not saying you should never play it. I'm saying if you played it, you should probably be unhappy.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing to get over, because I think most people, when they put that card in their deck, will recognize, hey, this isn't a great card for my deck, but it's fine, and I'll play it. But that's not quite the same thing as looking at it and being like, crap, I have to play Broodhunter Worm. I screwed something up, which is, there's a gap there. And I think that the second one is more accurate than the first.
Yeah, and that's a stark departure again from, Summit Prowler, which was regarded as one of the better red commons. and it was harder to cast.
Yeah, he was good.
Yeah, Broodhunter Worm is a perfect example of that. So what I think you should do to familiarize yourself with the format is first try to figure out what are the different good decks, and the decks that I think are decks you should strive to be in are decks like Life Gain, Ingest, Devoid Aggro, Converge, and to some extent Allies as well, even though I like Allies a little less than those. I've cooled off on Allies since the last week.
What about Blue-White Flyers?
And then Blue-White Flyers, but the reason I think Blue-White Flyers is a little different is that Blue-White Flyers actually does conform to your idea of a generic limited deck.
It totally does. It's so weird, right? Like, they just threw us this curveball of like, you want to be all in on all these archetypes, except for this one's just like normal. It's really funny.
And, I noticed that especially when I was looking for examples of cards that have been good or would be good in other formats but aren't good here. Blue-White has a lot of cards that would have made that list, except they just have flying, and that actually turns out to be good enough. So Blue-White Flyers is definitely a non-linear, as in you're not really looking for anything specific, just good magic cards that actually just somehow works. So I think it's just because flying is so good and because the awaken spells are so good. It's just the actual power level is there. Whereas when you're looking at cards, other cards in like blue, black, and red for the Devoid cards, or white, black for the Ally Life Gain theme, the power level in those colors is just not high enough to support a deck if it's not one of these linear decks. Whereas Blue-White has a combination of good enough creatures and good enough spells that you can end up there. So let's just quickly go over kind of what are the powerful cards that belong in each of these buckets or categories. Like for allies, it's cards like Unified Front, Retreat to Emeria, Tajuru Warcaller, Fire Mantle Mage.
Yeah, these are great examples. These are kind of your payoff cards in the allies deck.
And so these are the cards that pull you into allies because they're good in allies, great in allies even. Like Tajuru Warcaller is just amazing if you have a bunch of allies in your deck. And don't, not all of them, but a lot of these don't tend to fit all that well in non-ally decks because, like, look at a Fire Mantle Mage. If you're only triggering that the turn you play it, it's just not a great card. If you can trigger it, 2 to 3 times per game, it starts to become a very good card. So when you take one of these cards, you should realize that this card has a bunch of implicit, like, play me with, attached. And in this case, it's allies. Play me with allies.
Mm-hmm.
Another archetype I like a lot is the Black-White Life Gain deck. And this has cards like Serene Steward, Retreat to Emeria, Calastra Healer, and Bloodbond Vampire. And notice I said Retreat to Emeria twice. That's because Retreat to Emeria is one of those cards that's just good in a lot of different decks. Right. And I think that card maybe is a little deceptive because it's just good in any white deck, but it turns out it's actually really good in the allies decks or the life gain decks, which also overlap, So Retreat to Emeria is one of those cards that you really should be looking for. But like cards like Serene Steward or Bloodbond Vampire or Calastra Healer, these are just like the top couple examples of cards that are, 7+, 7, 8, 9 out of 10s in the right deck and 2s in the wrong deck. And I think the reason a lot of people feel like they're getting kicked by this format is they take cards that look like 7s in the right deck and put them in decks where they're 2s. Right. So just knowing how to avoid that, knowing that what the implications of each card are is really important. And when you take a Colostria Healer 3rd pick, which I think is fine some of the time, know that you have to end up in the life gain deck for it to really be a 3rd pick, for it to really be a card you know worth taking early and putting in your deck.
Yeah, and you know the cards that go in the bucket for this, you know, we've picked a few examples here, but the cards that you want to look for are the ones that enable the strategy and the ones that pay off the strategy, right? So Colostria Healer I view as an enabler. It basically lets you continually often drain your opponent for 1 multiple times throughout the course of the game, which is a reasonable effect on its own. But to really hammer it home, to make it the big payoff, you want the Bloodbond Vampire that Luis just mentioned. I mean, you play that thing with the healer out, and it's a 4/4 already. Like, just straight up comes in, gets a counter, and you're ready to rumble. And, you know, that's a huge payoff, because oftentimes before it actually attacks, it's a 5/5 or a 6/6, and it gets out of hand really, really quickly. That's a big payoff for the card, or for the deck. So all of a sudden, you know, a card like Bloodbomb Vampire goes up, its stock goes through the roof if you're in this life gain deck. But if you're playing, you know, basically any other black deck in the format, the card's effectively unplayable. It's a 3/3 for 4 that maybe gets a +1/+1 counter at some point, you know, if you do something weird in your deck, and the card's just worthless, right? So, you know, this is, again, why we see cards like Bloodbond Vampire in this particular bucket and not in others. And as you go through, you know, go over the list of the set, or go over the archetypes that you like, and start to figure out, well, where do these cards fit in? Because, like, maybe we'll see Bloodbond Vampire pop up in another archetype too. But I'll tell you what, we probably won't. And that means that this is the one deck that it really, you know, is an absolute crusher, and you need to prioritize it if you're in this deck.
So another deck that has, you know, a lot of this stuff going on is the ingest deck. This is where you're trying to pair the cards that exile cards with the cards that you make use of those cards. And, you know, cards like Mist Intruder are key to this deck. Mist Intruder is a very high pick if you're in this deck. And
gotta have it.
Not only that, it also is a good signal. So when you see a 6-pick Mist Intruder pack 1, you should think long and hard. I don't know what your first 5 picks are. Obviously, if they're, you know, a bunch of great black-white allies cards, then fine, stay. But if you're waffling, if you don't have a strong place to go, and you see a 6-pick Mist Intruder, it's a good sign that you should go into that deck, because if someone first picked a couple Processor or Devoid cards early, they would take Mist Intruder. The fact that no one has makes it less likely that that's the case. And the payoff really is there. It did deliver. So Mist Intruder is a great example, because that's a complete on-off card. It's just great in the right deck and horrible in the wrong one. Like, if you put this in your blue-white Flyers deck, you are not going to be happy with the results.
You are miserable, yeah.
Benthic Infiltrator is a more interesting one, because it is, or rather, not interesting, actually. Mist Intruder is a more interesting one. It's a safer one, because it's just a great card. You can play Benthic Infiltrator in non-ingest or devoid decks. This is the 1/4 unblockable with ingest, because it's just a good card. It's a 3-mana 1/4, blocks well, can peck in for damage. It's a kind of free way to get all these things going. So it's a card that I actually don't mind 2nd or 3rd picking, or even 1st picking out of a weak pack. I'm okay with doing that. I think the ingest deck is good enough. And this is certainly a card where if you see it late, you should be taking it, because it's a great signal.
Yeah.
So good.
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah. So it's key that you know how to draft the ingest deck, and then you look at cards like Vile Aggregate, the uncommon that's X5, which is with Trample ingest. This card's just incredible. It's good in the decks where it's good, and it's, you know, not great outside of those decks, but it's just fantastic in those decks. So Vile Aggregate's a great card. And then Sledge Crawler, the one mana 1/1 that pumps +1/+1 for 2 mana. This card's really good. Sledge Crawler,
it's really performed. Yeah,
it's just a key part of the ingest deck, because when you play it on turn 1, you're often able to get a hit in, because it just comes out so early. And when you draw it on turn 10, it's actually like a 5/5 or a 6/6, and that is good enough.
Yeah, I've been really impressed by that card too.
So the ingest deck is kind of where these cards land, and these are the cards you should be like, this is where I should be going, and, you know, keeping an eye on cards for these as signals. And then the ingest deck bleeds into the Devoid aggro deck. A lot of the cards overlap, like Vile Aggregate. I don't even know which deck it's better in. It's just insane in both decks, with the Devoid aggro deck being frequently like red-black and much more aggressive. It doesn't really care about exiling cards very much, more cares about just attacking your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
Sledge Crawler also overlaps here, and it's useful to know the overlaps. You have to know both where the cards belong, which is kind of, we're giving you just like the very top level view of the top 4 or 5 cards here, and where and which, not only where they belong, but also how many different places they belong. Because you need to know that when you've started with like, Sludge Crawler and then another black card, you can go into either blue black or black red, and it's going to be good in both places. But if you start with Mist Intruder, you can't go into blue white, not based on Mist Intruder. You can go into blue black or blue red Devoid Ingest, but blue white is not an option, or at least you can go into blue white, but don't factor in the Mist Intruder. It's not a card when you do that.
Right. And and there is a hierarchy there as well. I like the blue-black version for Mistintruder better than I do the blue-red version for Mistintruder, even if you can play it in both. Just as an example, it's not going to be always, they're not all equal in each of them, and you're going to have to kind of figure out which one you prefer it in and which one you'll play it in and which one it's bad in, and you'll kind of work your way through each card that way.
Exactly. And then, a couple other cards that you should be looking to fit into Devoid aggro, but not really anywhere else. Something like Silent Skimmer, the 0/4 that drains them for 2 when you attack. Mm-hmm. This is an aggressive card.
I wish it drained.
Don't mistake it. Well, yes, I guess it just they lose 2, you don't gain 2.
Right.
And then something like Kozilek Sentinel, the 1/4 that gets +1/+0 when you play a colorless spell. This is better when every card in your deck triggers it and you're beating down. Something like Molten Nursery would also belong here.
Right.
The enchantment that pings for 1 when you play a colorless card. So one of the best group of decks in the format, and one that I know a couple of teams actually intended to force going in, which I don't advise, by the way. Forcing is generally not, I think, a good way to draft, is just these various family of Grixis Devoid decks. It's blue-black, black-red, or red-blue, or some combination of those, sometimes 3 colors, where you're either using Devoid synergies like Ruination Guide or Tide Drifter that give all your colorless creatures a bonus, or Ingest Processor synergies, or cards like Molten Nursery. Basically, all these cards work together in some way, and yes, you can sometimes end up with hey, I'm a processor, and you don't actually have that many ingestors and that sort of thing. But in general, if you put a bunch of colorless cards in your deck and you're these colors, it's going to work well together.
Right.
So
now, go ahead.
Figuring out how to draft that family of decks is one of the main skills for this format, because that they dominate kind of the limited landscape.
Yeah, and like I said, I actually wrote about those for the column this week, so you can get my thoughts on them. And I went through and said which ones I liked and kind of broke down the basics on how each one works. And it's interesting. I mean, just as a quick aside, I mean, those 3 decks play out quite differently than each other, right? The blue-black one tends to be more controlling. The red-black one tends to be more aggressive, and the blue-red one tends to be a little bit more in the middle. And they each play out differently, and they each value the cards differently. Again, you're going to play a Vile Aggregate in your black-red or your blue-red version. That card's not going to get cut out of either of them, but if you had to pick, it probably goes a little bit better maybe in the black version, just because it rewards you for beating down a little more. But whatever, you're never going to cut it. But then there are cards that do dip significantly. There's a lot of good payoff for ingesting that are black cards. Maybe not a lot, but there's a few. And there's relatively few in any of the other colors outside of blue. And so your Mistintruder, is going to be a lot happier in a blue-black Devoid deck than it is in a blue-red Devoid deck. And these are things that you should consider when you're kind of putting things in different buckets here as you sort of survey the landscape and start to really get an idea of where each of these cards settles in. And then when it comes to actually applying it, you're going to know, well, I need to adjust the strength level of this card in a draft so that if I open up a Mistintruder and I don't have any other ways to get ingest going, and I have some good ingest payoffs, and that card skyrockets in value for you, and you're going to want to take it higher, versus if you happen to be, let's say, in the blue-red version, where you're not getting the massive payoff from having ingest going. You maybe have some, so it is worth picking up, but it isn't going to skyrocket the value where it's just this must-have item that you can't pass. So, again, these buckets are going to help you figure out which one sits where, and then within those, you're going to have to kind of gauge it as you go, because some of these decks really do need certain cards or certain types of cards just to make them go, where other ones just reward you for having more. I think sticking on this same comparison is the blue-black ingest deck needs ingest enablers, period, to be the best it can be. You have to have some number of Mist Intruders, Benthic Infiltrators, and what is he called? Sludge Crawler?
Sludge Crawler.
Yeah, you need those. If you go through the whole drafting this type of deck, but don't pick those up, your deck is going to be very bad. And so that plays out in that way, where you've kind of got these A and B type pieces that need to come together to make the deck good. But if you look at the blue and red version of the Devoid deck, it actually just tends to award you not for ingesting as much, but for just having more colorless cards in your deck. If you can just have every card in your deck be colorless, you'd be quite happy with that, and you would reap the rewards. Like you mentioned, Molten Nursery can do it. Cards like Nettle Drone pay you off for having all colorless spells in your deck, and there's a few others as well. And you'll see that the prominence of the whole ingest thing dips down in that 2-color archetype versus the blue-black one, where it holds a more prominent position. So again, there's going to be differences between the buckets, and it's your job to kind of put the cards in where they go, and then understand that they're not going to be equal across different buckets if they happen to fit into multiple ones.
And the last really themed deck that I want to talk about is Converge, which is, again, this loosely touches allies, but it's base green, whereas some of the ally decks are more base white, like black white or white red. And that's some of the Converge cards that you should be prioritizing are like Lifespring Druid, the 2/1 that taps for any color, Evolving Wilds. So funnily enough, when we were trying to analyze the format and figure out where our pick order stood and what compares to what, on our team, Evolving Wilds was one of our litmus tests for how high you should be taking certain commons, because it turns out Evolving Wilds is just a very high pick. You should not be surprised to be taking Evolving Wilds 3rd to 4th pick, like, frequently.
Okay.
And Evolving Wilds is
that's interesting. Yeah.
It's at its best in the Converge deck, first of all. Second of all, this format in general does not have a ton of fixing, and you often just want to touch another color. So Evolving Wilds is it signals Converge to me, but it can also go in a lot of different directions. Tajuru Stalwart, the 2 and a green Converge to 0/1. This is one of the key cards in the deck, because one of the payoffs for being a dedicated Converge deck is you end up with 3/4 Stalwarts on turn 3 a lot, and that is awesome. If you can do that, you have a very good defense against a lot of the decks in the format. And then your payoff cards are cards like Skyrider Elf, the blue-green X Converge card with flying. And Converge is one of the looser ones. And again, this isn't a comprehensive list of all the decks, because there's a lot of decks in the format. This is more like, here's just like a quick couple examples for a bunch of these like somewhat linear decks, because figuring out which cards belong where and which cards don't belong where is part of the key here. And Skyrider Elf is one of the cards that belongs in Converge. You shouldn't be that interested if you're not in Converge, especially since I found that the 2-color blue-green deck is almost not a thing.
Right. And weird, right? Like, there's another little asterisk that we have to add on again, right? Which is like, okay, well, we've talked about blue-black and black-red and blah, 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 but we haven't talked about blue-green. And the reason is there isn't really a deck there. There just doesn't seem to be a collection of super powerful cards. And what ends up happening in the blue-green deck is that not only you incentivize, but you just sort of ultimately end up playing more colors than just blue-green. And it ends up kind of like this Converge deck.
And figuring out all these little intricacies, which we, again, can't explain in one or even just a couple shows, it's how you get better at the format. It's tricky. We're going to try to go over as many as we can. Like that little tidbit, like blue-green's not a deck, is pretty important, because you might think that, hey, I can take Skyrider Elf and then a blue card, then a green card, and just draft blue-green. And in my experience, that just has not worked out well.
Right. So, same with mine, by the way.
So knowing that is just another, tool in your arsenal. So one of the key parts about figuring out where these cards belong is which cards belong in multiple places. Because then not only do you know that you can take these cards earlier because they are, safer, cards that fit into multiple decks are clearly safer than cards that fit into one, but also when these cards allow you to pivot or switch. If you, for example, Vile Aggregate is on the list because it goes into every single Devoid deck very well. If you have, 2 blue ingest type cards in a Vile Aggregate, but then you see Forerunner of Slaughter, the 3/2 black and red gold card that gives colorless creatures haste, you see that fourth. You should know that you could take it and kind of audible into black-red Devoid aggro if that's what's open. And getting a card that powerful fourth is generally a sign that it could be open.
Are you not going to name this bucket?
Oh, In the show notes, I put multi-bucket madness,
which is great.
With 3 exclamation points.
Yeah, underlined.
I mean, I don't know. I used to play pinball, so
there you go.
Multi-ball madness.
Yeah, I love it. That's great.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, my favorite part of pinball is what happens when you shake the machine too much.
Tilt.
So, yeah, Violent Aggregate is one of these cards. It's the card that lets you pivot. It's a card that gives you good flexibility. And these cards are also very powerful. The reason they're in multiple buckets is because of their power. Retreat to Meria is one I mentioned earlier. Angel of Renewal is one that you put on the list because Angel of Renewal, the 4/4 that gains you a life for every creature you have, is an ally. It works in life gain. It works in the Go Wide Tokens ally deck. It's good in blue-white flyers. This is just, a solid first pick.
Right. And it's just one of those cards, again, that hits the multi-bucket madness because of its ability to slot into multiple decks, and it will be sought after by multiple decks as well. It's not a narrow card. The fact that it has ally on there adds it into a whole nother archetype, and the life gain deck doesn't mind playing one of these either because it does gain you a good chunk of life. And like you said, it goes into the Flyers deck too.
But a key difference between these cards and the next group, which is a much less cool name than Multi-Bucket Madness, I have to say, is that cards like, Vile Aggregate especially is like, this card you do need to do work. This is not hey, you can put this card in any deck that's red and expect good things. Whereas the next category, powerful bucketless cards, these are the cards that, they unfortunately don't have a single bucket to their name.
Sad.
Are just great cards, and their only requirement really is in the top right corner, which is, can you cast this? This is, Rolling Thunder, Grip of Desolation, Clutch of Currents, Dampening Pulse, Deathless Behemoth. Turns out these are just great cards. You don't have to do any work. You just have to put them in your deck. You get to cast them. They get to, do awesome things.
Yeah. And the thing is that these can be kind of tricky to spot, right? For example, Rolling Thunder doesn't seem to have synergies, but it's right. But it's super powerful, so that one's pretty easy. But like, you might get tripped up on Grip of Desolation and say, "Oh, well, it's devoid. It exiles the thing, so I probably want that in a blue-black devoid deck, right?" But then you resolve it, and you're like, "Wait a minute! Any deck that can cast this wants this card." So this goes in the powerful bucketless cards bucket because, again, even though it has some earmarks of a card that looks like it may be slotted in for, the blue-black deck or something along those lines, it's not. It's just powerful enough that you don't care about anything other than the fact that it often kills 2 threats, on your opponent's side of the board. So there's some little, again, and I keep saying it, but this is part of the fun of it, right? Is to at first look at a card like Grip and say, oh, okay, I'm going to probably put this in the blue-black bucket because of the whole exile thing, and that's a good thing. And then eventually realizing that, oh, hell no, this card's just great. Where if you look at Rolling Thunder, it had such a reputation coming in, as it is a reprint, that I think that you would probably not, automatically put that into some other bucket. It just looks pretty good on its own, and it turns out it's amazing. And so it just goes right in the list here too.
And that was a really good point that I want to emphasize on Grip of Desolation, because the corollary or the flip side to, hey, make sure you have a deck where Mist Intruder is good and know what that deck is don't think cards like Grip of Desolation belong in the deck that it looks like they belong to when they're just a great card.
When it's just great.
And Grip of Desolation is just a great card. Any deck that can cast it should play it because it's just fantastic. So this is the reverse of these other cards. This is the card that is just powerful and asks nothing of you. And it's tricky. You just have to know where all these cards go, and we're going to try to give you the tools to investigate those. But some of it is just experience. Some of it is maybe, as we go in deeper over the next couple shows, we'll give you more examples. But in general, just consuming as much content you can and also doing as many drafts as you can will give you this information. But yeah, don't just know where to classify cards, because cards like Grip of Desolation are very good, and you should not paint yourself into a corner by thinking they're only good in a certain deck, whereas cards like Mist Intruder and Colostria Healer are really good in their deck, but not outside of their deck. And then cards like, Broodhunter Worm or Ondu Greatheart or Belligerent Whiptail, the cards from our last category, these are cards that are not good in any deck. And they actually look like they should be okay, but they're just really not. So these are the cards that cards that will not get you buckets.
Right, no buckets. Yeah, and that is the last section there. But I wanted to put a punctuation mark on what Luis just said, which is that I want you as a listener to think about these things, right? To evaluate the cards and to not make assumptions about where you think that they fit and where they don't fit. Because we have discovered in the early part of the format that many things are not quite the way that they appeared on the surface, whether that was you viewed the card in a vacuum and now that you see it in its natural habitat, it looks a lot better, or the thing that we just mentioned with Grip of Desolation, where maybe you earmark a card to be in a certain type of deck, but really it goes into any deck that can cast it, or even a lesser form of that, where maybe you say, this card's really good in this deck, but then you realize that actually it's good in one other deck too. And it just wasn't obvious to you. Either maybe you missed something. We were talking about the Angel of Renewal. You're like, oh, it's an ally. Oh, wow. Right. I totally forgot it was an ally. And now all of a sudden, you open up the world to the ally world, to Angel of Renewal. And that's something that you're going to keep in your head when you go forward, where maybe before that you thought, okay, that card's in blue-white flyers and life gain and full stop. I don't really want it anywhere else. But then, you realized, oh crap, it's an ally. And now it goes into that one as well. And it's going to take some work for you. But I think that every draft is a new opportunity to take a look at that and to say, all right, well, what's actually important here? What's actually going on with this card? Where else could I see this scene play? Does this fill the niche that another deck that I play often looks like it might need? Also, when you play out your matches, you get to watch your opponents play against you. And when they play cards that seem to go well in a deck, really put some critical thinking to it and say, well, now wait a minute. I didn't expect to see this card in this deck. And did it perform well? Did it do what I thought? And I mean, I'll even just ask my opponents, like after a match, I'll just sometimes, if we're having a nice rapport, I'll just say something like, how's that card been for you? Now I don't ask because I expect my opponent to have like a well thought out, perfect response that's going to be, the gospel or whatever. But you know what? I'm willing to listen to what somebody has to say about a card here and then kind of put my own experiences to it as well. And if they said, this card's really surprised me. It's been great. Way better than I thought it would be. Well, then that's just a little data point for me of like, maybe I need to check that one out. That might be a little better than I thought. And if they say, I was a little short on playables, so I ran it and it kind of did what I thought it would do, which is not a whole lot. Okay, then that's another data point where I say, I thought there was some potential there, but maybe it doesn't quite fit. And, this is the process that you go through. And when they give us a set like this, it has a lot of layers and a whole lot going on top of the normal limited stuff of, drafting a mana curve and having spells and synergies and all that stuff. It's a great opportunity to learn. And you mentioned it earlier, Luis, but I think it's really important is that this type of set also sets you up for the future. I mean, if you can get really good at a set like this and understand how to kind of break everything down and really work through it over the course of time, you're going to be able to break down future sets that play out in a similar fashion. And that's a really great skill to have because it's no fun feeling blindsided, right? I think that that's been part of the reason why we've gotten feedback about it of I'm feeling nervous or I don't really understand what's going on or I just haven't been able to put this format together I think you just feel a little bit like overwhelmed, a little daunted by what's in front of you. But after having gone through it and after having kind of worked for it a little bit, you'll have a lot more tools and a lot more ideas about how to approach it when another set like this pops up. And it will. I mean, they will often mix up the complexity and the how linear a format is. And I'm sure it'll happen again as well.
Yeah, don't mistake what you're learning in this set as one shot. I have to learn all this and then it's just going to be useless. Maybe I should just, take a break. Definitely don't do that because what you learn here helps you evaluate the next time we get this. And we will get this again, like Marshall just said. And, part of the reason I love formats like this is I've drafted them many times and I can apply those past lessons, not in a way that like I instantly know what every card does and where it fits and how good things are because clearly I didn't know that walking in, but because I know how to evaluate, I have the tools to look here. What are the connections you should be making? What are the things, the clues you should look for? And in the case of Grip of Desolation, the clues are misleading. Exile doesn't really have anything to do with how the card actually ends up playing, which is just fantastically, even though it's better in the Exile deck, clearly. But it does
same with Devoid.
Right. But it does help you with like Mist Intruder, which is, hey, this is clearly an engine card. Everyone who saw that called that out. Well, some of the cards are maybe a little less obvious than that, and trying to figure out, how useful those are and how good they are helps save you some time. You can ignore cards like Brood Hunter Worm pretty quickly. It did not take me long to realize it's just not a card I wanted, because I just could tell from looking at the type line and looking at its stats and looking at its cost, it doesn't actually accomplish any of the goals in this format. And that made me predisposed not to like it. And then when it turned out poorly, it kind of made it a little bit more clear to me. So what you learn here when in battling for Zendikar will certainly be able to be applied again, and I think it'll just make you a better Magic player too.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. Well, hopefully this is helpful for the listeners, and hopefully you feel a little more confident with another tool under your belt as we trudge forward into Battle for Zendikar and things start to become more clear and more clear. And these really are some of the most fun formats to draft after you get over that initial hump of kind of getting everything sorted, because, man, some of the decks you can put together are really powerful and really fun and can do some things that are of higher power level than we get normally. In a air quotes normal set, and that can be pretty fun.
As an example, the deck I did draft to the Pro Tour was this Converge deck that had 2 copies of Exert Influence, the control magic.
Holy smokes, you had 2 of them?
I did. I got it 2nd and 7th pack 1, which shows you that even at the Pro Tour, not everyone knows how to evaluate the cards, because wow. I can't construct a pack where it's correct for Exert Influence to go 7th. 2nd, I certainly can, but 7th, I mean, the card is just too good for that to be
that seems
possible.
Yeah.
And I got to have a game where I discarded Desolation Twin to Brilliant Spectrum, and then I played Emeria Shepherd and then played Evolving Wilds and got a Plains.
Oh my God, are you serious?
My deck went pretty deep.
What did you get with the Evolving Wilds?
I got a Plains with Evolving Wilds.
No, but you get a trigger from it, right?
An Eyeless Watcher, the 1/1 that makes
Oh man, just shields up. So that turn you could make like 3, 4, 5, like 6 creatures or something. This is crazy.
Yeah, it was.
That's great.
Well, Desolation Twin unfortunately doesn't trigger off Shepherd because it's on 1 cast.
Oh, it's just a 10/10?
So it was just a 10/10.
For the low cost of playing.
I mean, that deck was kind of odd. It had a ton of rares in it. I also had 3 of the rare dual lands, so it had like 7 rares in it. So that's not your typical case, but that sort of deck is within the range of decks in this format, which is a lot of fun. And that actually leads me nicely into the very last thing, which is just a couple brief tips, more general tips I found for this format. One is that take mana fixing very highly. I talked about Evolving Wilds earlier, and Evolving Wilds is just a really high pick. Pilgrim's Eye is a high pick. Even the rare battle lands, I think, are pretty high picks, because a lot of decks end up wanting to splash a card. I find this is true in the Devoid deck. Sometimes you just want to splash that Vile Aggregate in your blue-black deck, and if you have mana fixing, you can. If your plan is to play 7 swamps, 8 islands, 3 mountains, that's not very good. But once it turns into, like, let's say you had 2 Evolving Wilds, then you can play like 2 mountains and then still have enough blue and black sources.
Right.
So fixing is really, really important. Allies push you to 3 colors. Converge pushes you to 3 to 5 colors. So there's just legitimate reasons to take these fixing cards very early. And it actually feels like the set does not have enough fixing for what the themes are trying to do. And that just means it's such a scarce resource that you're going to have to take it earlier than you think you will. Okay. And then the second is more of a short-term trick than a long-term trick, which is learn to draft a particular deck. And I said earlier I don't like forcing, and I don't. But if you want to learn a format, I think one way to get comfortable is learn to draft one deck and just draft that deck. I know some people who do this at the Pro Tour because they just don't feel like they have enough time to learn everything. And if you think that it's that you're not comfortable, trying to tackle this whole format, just spend like 3 or 4 drafts forcing one deck and learn how to draft that deck. Maybe even more drafts. Sometimes I've drafted the same deck 5 or 6 times. And once you learn how to draft that one deck, first of all, you'll know how to draft that deck. So when that deck is open, you'll be in a good position. Second, learning how to draft that deck will also secretly teach you how to draft the other decks, because it will at least give you the tools of what kind of things it takes to put together a synergy deck.
Yeah, that's a really good one. A sub tip along those lines is play close attention to what your opponents are doing too, because sometimes they will have drafted a deck in a way that you didn't see, and it might open your eyes, a little bit to a way or a certain card that the decks play out in where you maybe have dismissed it early, and it's something that you shouldn't have.
Yep.
All right. Well, that will do it for this week. Again, hopefully you're feeling good and confident as you head into the next draft. Make sure you have some fun with it too. I mean, you don't want to get too caught up in all this stuff. It's still magic. It's still fun. Make sure you're enjoying yourself as you conduct your science experiments out there in the wild as well. If you would like to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can send us an email if you got something a little longer to say. I'm pretty behind on getting replies out, but I do reply to every email. So as long as you have patience, you will receive a reply at some point. LR@LRcast is where you can do that. And for everything related to the show, including links to the column I mentioned earlier, to the streams that we mentioned and all that kind of stuff, you can find it at LRcast.com. I also want to remind you that Limited Resources is brought to you by channelfireball.com. The place to go to pick up any single sealed product or anything else that you need to play Magic. Again, a bunch of free content. And if you're planning on coming up to the GP, it's gpctac.com. We'll see you from the airwaves there as, again, there's going to be coverage from Channel Fireball there. So that'll be pretty sweet too. That is going to do it for the show this week. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out. We truly appreciate it. And we'll talk to you next week. All right, you tell them.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So the suggestion in our Patreon question of the week from Adam was, hey, what about each of you describes what a typical day in the life of the other person is, just based on your assumptions? Oh
God, why did I agree to this? I already know I'm just going to get destroyed, but I did write up what I think a typical Luis day is like. So should I go first?
Yeah, you can go first.
Why did I do this, Louis? Why? Like I thought that idea too. Let's do it. And then after I realized it, I'm like, I'm just gonna get destroyed. Anyway, here it is. Are you ready? This is a day in the life of Luis Scott-Vargas. An alarm blares "Blank Space" by Taylor Swift at 7 a.m., waking Luis from his slumber. While thinking about what kind of burrito he wants for lunch, Luis settles on beans and a hard-boiled egg for breakfast. Before leaving his house, he checks his Twitter followers to see if he's gained his usual 1,000 overnight or if it's been a slow night. On the way to work, he listens to Tales from the Crypt reruns for pun research purposes. Upon arrival at work, Luis greets many of his good friends, including Raptor and Matt Nass, before settling into his workday. A reminder on his phone goes off during a work meeting to text Marshall a monkey picture taken at random. On lunch, at Chipotle, of course, he splits time between drafting too many 7-drops on Magic Online and setting up a game of Werewolf for his coworkers where there is no werewolf. His accountant calls requesting an urgent call regarding why he's bought his friends so many meals over the last year. On the way home, he stops by a store to pick up his newly polished aviators and a fresh can of mustache wax. His phone chimes with another reminder to send Marshall yet another random monkey picture. This one also reminds him to send Paul Chion a text with just the word Paul in it. Luis eats a burrito with a side of French toast for dinner. He fires up the stream, and where he drafts an expensive clunky deck before retreating to the comfort of his Lantern control deck. As evening exercise, he hits a basketball court where he hits exactly 80% of his elbow jump shots and nothing else. He cracks a Battle for Zendikar booster draft at random, opening an Expedition Sunken Hollow. He sends a text of the pack to Marshall, lamenting his bad luck at not getting the Scalding Tarn he wanted. Luis falls asleep, watching his Oblivion Ring video on repeat.
that was pure poetry.
I'm assuming that's what an average day looks like for you.
You also wrote that before I described my average day, which had some striking similarities.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say I nailed a couple there.
You did. On the other hand, I've got a day in the life of Marshall, and I think this one's a good one.
All right.
It's a day in the life of Marshall, as guessed by LSV. So it's a Wednesday. And the reason it's a Wednesday is because Marshall flew in on Monday. He was at a Grand Prix. He's going to fly out on Thursday. He's got another Grand Prix. So definitely has to be a Wednesday. Marshall wakes up at the crack of noon. He was up until about 4 a.m. streaming.
Yeah.
He eats a power breakfast. It consists of a banana and a banana smoothie. Now he's feeling pretty good. He's in fighting shape. He gets in his BMW. He drives to a pickup basketball game. He plays well because he's very, very tall. Marshall then records a podcast, some kind of resource, not clear which. He then goes to the tall store and buys some clothes. Oh, it's time to play some more basketball. Back in the BMW, back to the basketball court. Looks like it's dinner time. Marshall has dinner with the lovely Rosa. Time for the post-dinner basketball game. Marshall then decides to, relax and unwind. He watches the local basketball team on television. Time to write an article. What should I write about Limited? Then it's time to stream again. Marshall streams until 4 a.m., at which point he eats a banana.
This was too close to home, buddy. That was way too close to home. You almost nailed my day perfectly.
Is it really called the Tall Store?
It's called the Big and Tall Store. And I have actually a funny story about the Big and Tall Store. I did go there once to try to buy a shirt, and they told me that they didn't have anything for me. And I said, but I'm tall. And they said, you're not big enough. And I said, what do you mean I'm not big enough? And they said, no, this is the Big and Tall Store. And I thought they were joking, and they were completely serious. They're like, we start at size whatever, and it goes up from there, and it's all like in long. And they're like, you're not big enough. And they sent me away, and I did not buy a shirt.
This is one of the most savage brags I've ever heard.
Not really. I didn't buy the shirt.
I'm incredibly tall, but don't worry, I'm in great shape. I'm not big.
But I'm not. That's the thing. I thought, well, they'll have something. And they're like, no, get out of here.